That's as close as I get to a sophisticated idea tonight, so I'm going to risk boring you by saying it again, or at least I'll ask you if that made some sense. His point is that the very existence of people with different beliefs is fundamentally challenging, because if your beliefs serve a death-denying function, and somebody has different beliefs, well, if I believe that God created the earth in 6 days, and if somebody in the South Pacific, the Borneo, they believe that the earth was gestated out of a giant coconut. Well, we both can't be right, so if I accept the validity of the coconut story, I necessarily undermine the confidence that I have in my own and expose myself to the very anxiety those beliefs were designed to reduce. That's problem number one. Problem number two is even more daunting. And here Becker relies on another very good idea from William James. He says, well, you know what? Culture and our symbolic beliefs are very potent, but death is a very real physical event, and no symbol is powerful enough to completely eradicate the anxiety engendered by death. William James had a very lovely phrase. He just says, there will always be a panic rumbling beneath the surface of consciousness. And in psychodynamic terms, the argument is that what we do is we take that death, residual death anxiety, we repress it, but because it's so uncomfortable, we project it onto other groups or other people that we designate as the all-encompassing repositories of evil, the eradication of which would make life on earth as it is purported to be in heaven. Either way, whether we run into people who are different or whether we declare people to be evil incarnate, what he goes on to propose is that what we usually do when we encounter those folks is first of all to derogate or belittle them. So when we run into folks, I believe God created the earth in 6 days, the Fulani tribe in Mali, they believe that God created the earth out of a giant drop of milk. But then again, those poor bastards are ignorant savages. They live in tents. They worship piles of sticks and mud. They don't have iPhones or email. And if they did, they would obviously dispose of that ridiculous nonsense and embrace the real truth instead. Now, I hope you realize that I'm being silly here, but the point is of radical importance. When we belittle the beholder of an alternative belief, that diminishes the threat that that belief poses to us. Again, head shakes for me for an emotional boost, if that made sense. Right? And then the second thing that he does, vodka, very good. All right, so we derogate folks that are different. At the same time that we do that, we try to convince, and if that doesn't work, compel them to dispose of their beliefs and to adopt ours instead. You're very familiar with this. Missionary activity, political proselytization. And I think, once again, there's an important and subtle idea here. What Becker says is, most of our beliefs, culturally constructed beliefs about the nature of reality, can never be proven or disproven. In fact, they're highly unlikely to be literally true. And so the way that we maintain our confidence in them is by social consensus. And so where I live in New York, I don't know if you have any of these folks here, if you go to Penn Station, it's the big train station in New York City, you'll often see unfortunate homeless folks kind of huddled up in the corner, often saying rather florid things, because these folks are typically psychiatric patients. So let's picture a single individual, homeless in the train station, saying, I believe a large bearded gentleman created all of the heavens and all of the earth in 6 days. If he was the only person who believed that, would it not be tempting to reach for the largest bottle of antipsychotic medication at your disposal to relieve him of that unfortunate delusion? But when 2 billion people believe that, it becomes one of the world's great religions. And I don't mean to be cynical. What I mean to do is to just convey the point that the psychological impetus for wanting other people to share our beliefs is that the more of them who do so, the more confident we can be of their veracity. Finally, if that doesn't work, just kill those bastards, thus proving that your ideas were right after all. My silly phrase is, my God is better than your God, and we will kick your ass to prove it. And what Becker notes, and this is primarily in his last, and in my opinion, one of his finest books, Escape from Evil, what he says is, look, I believe this to be the primary psychological explanation for protracted ethnic conflict. And I do think it's important not to be simple-minded here. He is not saying that that's the only reason why people fight each other. Clearly we fight each other for geography. Clearly we fight each other for natural resources. If Iraq was the world's largest repository of dog shit, I don't think we'd be overly concerned about importing our democratic ideas to that part of the earth. But Becker makes a tremendous point, and that is that even if we weren't fighting over land, even if we weren't fighting over resources, his belief is that we would still unfortunately be fighting because some violence and conflict is the result of a psychological inability to tolerate other people who don't share our death-denying beliefs. So that would be his account of man's inhumanity to man. All right, what about America being a petri dish of psychopathology? Why is it that over half of our citizens are depressed or addicted to drugs and alcohol, or the victims of anxiety disorders? And here what he asks us to do is to step back and to ponder the possibility that whenever a society appears to be riddled with epidemics of psychopathology, he says, you know what? I think we should look at the standards of self-esteem. What is it that the culture values? And let's ask ourselves whether or not the average citizen of that culture can realistically attain those standards of value. So let's think about the United States today, and let's talk about this by gender. If you're a guy, and to be silly and a little bit profane, there are two routes to self-esteem for the average American male. You can either have an exceptionally long penis, a dangling participle in the language of humanity. You can walk softly and carry a big stick, or Obama said that the other day. I don't think he was referring to the same thing, though. All right, so, or you can have a lot of money. Who's seen Donald Trump on TV? The guy's hair is purple. He looks like something out of a Frankenstein movie, but he still appears to be doing all right. And so, for males, money, sexual prowess. What about females? Well, you got to be thin in America. Who's aware of that? That if you're not thinner than a piece of linguine, if I can't floss my teeth with you, then you really shouldn't be out in public without wearing a commercial license plate. Not only do you need to be unrealistically svelte, but you have to stay pretty young for a long time. In fact, once you get to your late 20s, sorry ladies, but you're all done. You're a little chunky now, and once you get up there, you should just jump in a microwave and put it on high for 20 minutes so you can be shrunken like a little applehead, and then we can dangle you from our rearview mirrors in our cars as a quaint memento of yesteryear. No, the point that Becker makes, and I am again being somewhat sublimely ridiculous, but I think it's important, is we teach our kids early on, very early on, we teach people that if you tried hard enough, you can be as rich as Bill Gates or Donald Trump. And if you wanted to, you could be thinner than is humanly possible. And if you're not, it's your fault. And the point that Becker made is that that's a recipe for psychological despair. When we live in a culture that values things that could not be realistically attained by the average individual, that's highly problematic and something that we need to carefully consider. Finally, let's talk about the condition of planet Earth. I'm not checking my stocks, or I'm just seeing what time it is. All right, what about the condition of the planet upon which we reside? Two things here, and one of them just has to do with the fact that some of us, maybe a lot of us from time to time, are vaguely uncomfortable. Nature puts us in a state of dis-ease, because after all, everything natural that's alive is ultimately finite. That's why we had to conjure up quite ingeniously the supernatural or the unnatural as the only plane of existence upon which in which some form of immortality is possible. So one idea that Becker ponders from time to time is just this notion that we're kind of uncomfortable with nature, and we distance ourselves from it as a result of that vague sense of dis-ease. I don't think that's the main problem, however. What Becker focuses a good deal of attention on is that our destruction of the natural environment is an unintended but nevertheless very real consequence of our insatiable desire for money and stuff, money and consumption. And here he relies on some very old ideas, but they're also very important ideas. He talks about, for example, how people have always liked money, but right around, I don't know, 1700s or 1800s, that when belief in traditional religious ideologies waned a bit, who remembers Nietzsche's famous proclamation that God is dead? And that's a metaphor, of course, but what Becker wrote about was that when people's belief in an invisible dimension waned a bit as a consequence of the scientific and industrial revolution, that money literally replaced God as our new God. That psychologically speaking, people just thought, geez, if I had enough money, I can live forever. He even wrote a chapter in Escape from Evil called Money, the New Immortality Ideology. Not only are people preoccupied with acquiring money, but we're also really preoccupied with consuming unlimited amounts of stuff. Now, part of that, of course, is that we live in a culture that not only encourages conspicuous consumption, but suggests that there's something wrong about us if we don't keep doing that. I like Kierkegaard's take on this. He just said, well, you know what? Some people, when they don't have a confident sense of meaning and a strong belief in some kind of transcendent values, that they, and this is his phrase, he says they tranquilize themselves in the trivial. And I just love that phrase. And think about it for a moment. What's the average American doing as we now sit here? Probably a third of Americans are drinking or using drugs right now. Another third watching television to see who's going to drink the most yak urine on Survivor. The other third are at Walmart trying to save a dime on a machine gun and a lemon. And the point that Becker asks us to ponder is actually one that Max Weber, the German sociologist, advanced when he talked about the Protestant work ethic. What Weber said is, you know what? There's nothing intrinsically wrong with money. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with possessions, and that for a good part of human history, money and possessions, human beings use them as a means to an end, that we use them to enhance our lives and to enjoy our lives. But then what Weber says is that right around the beginning of the 20th century, maybe a little bit before that, that somehow the tables got turned, that what was originally a means to an end became an end in itself. Now we pursued money and stuff for its own sake. And who's ever heard of Weber's metaphor of the gilded cage? Is anybody familiar with that? Weber just said that things have gotten so inverted that we've been imprisoned in what he called a gilded cage. And then he said, and I found this profound and eerie, and he said, my fear is that we will not be able to get out of this cage until the last lump of coal has been burned. Now, of course, this is before petroleum, so if he was here today, I think he would modify that statement to, we will not be able to make any changes or get out of the cage until the last gallon of gas has been incinerated. Well, those would be Becker's ideas about how uniquely human concerns about mortality somehow contribute to the problems that we've identified. Well, all right, well, so what? I know that a lot of the things that I've said tonight might strike you as depressing, and they are, in fact, quite somber. And Becker does wonder at the end of Escape from Evil. He just says, well, you know what? I'm not sure we're a viable form of life. We are, after all, a very young species. And maybe self-conscious pieces of mortal meat was not such a good idea after all. And to the extent that that's true, we can just stop and go out and drink profusely. But I'd like to think that that's not the case.